Hello. Today we're looking at chapter 25 of a text, Grout, History of Western Music. And we're looking at that time in early to mid 1800s when we enter into what's called the Romantic era. We talked last time about Beethoven and sort of the characteristics of his music. And Beethoven spanned from the late 1700s, 1770 or 80-ish, to 1825, 27, somewhere in there. And he spanned that gap between the classic and the Romantic era, classic being Haydn, Mozart, that style of music, and then that winding up in the late 1700s. Mozart died in 1796, maybe 91 or 6. Beethoven was writing, and we saw some of the things about his music, the expansion of the genre into a greater expanse, really. In this chapter, we're looking at the beginnings of what is called the Romantic era. And this really starts around 1815 or so, and Beethoven is that transition and figure that we see in part of that. We're going to be talking about today, mostly the background of that, and then song and music, and then song and music, and then as we wind up the rest of this in our next discussion, we'll be looking at some of the pianistic music that's available. There's a plethora of composers that we look at over the span of these couple days. But we want to look first at just society and what's going on. And you recall that one of the things about Beethoven and about having things that were going on with his life is that Napoleon had been a part of the French Revolution, and that changed pretty much the whole landscape for, for the society of Europe. And I just want to remind you that as we talk about this music and music history, we're kind of focusing on, generally speaking, what's called Western music, and that is Western Europe, what we think of as Spain, France, Germany, Italy, some Poland, Netherlands, English, Irish, just Europe, and then the United States. And we dip down a little bit into Mexico. We have some influence from, a little bit of influence from Africa and from the East, but generally speaking, we're talking about Western music. Now, having said that, the French Revolution pretty much changed the whole landscape for Europe. And what that was became, because of that revolution in France, the peasants and the workers became allowed to become citizens of countries. And the ideas, the French ideas, the French Revolution were liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And those ideas spread to the other countries around Europe. Also in that, and became this idea of national identity. And then in 1814, 1815, there was an event called the Congress of Vienna. And at that Congress, they created a new map, so to speak. And I want to just share that with you. Of it. We see this map. And the kingdom, oops, come back. Sorry. Kingdom of France, the Austrian Empire. This is the Prussian Empire. Here we have England and Scotland and the Kingdom of Spain, as opposed to a bunch of little fiefdoms, is what they had been before. This is now coming into larger countries, the Russian Empire over here. And so that is the map of find my place here. Place in the sun. Oh, that's right for me. And so that is one of the things that came out of that. I also see new ideas popping up in the Americas in the early 1800s. Haiti, an independent state in Latin America, which is south of the United States, and revolutions in Latin America, the expansion of the United States, west and south. We call that the original 13 colonies are on the East Coast, west being in the early 1800s, Indiana, Illinois, over to about the Mississippi River, south across the Gulf states. And then the decline, and this is the most important for the things that we're looking at, the decline of Catholic patronage. That is that the aristocracy, because of all these wars, was less able to invest in and like having composers and orchestras, and it really became more a public event. Now that's some of the changes that were going on in music around the same time. In the 1813 or 14, there was this invention of the modern day valves for trumpets and French horns that are piston based. These the trumpet was this is a piston, and if you've ever pulled one of these out, you'll see that there are holes that line up with these different places and allow the air to travel through there. In the French horn, same idea. But instead of going up and down, the trigger pulls the valve mechanism so that the sound can go through the different areas and make it sound differently. Then the flute is another one of those inventions of the early 1800s that gives us an expanded sound out in the orchestra. Okay, again, the decline of aristocratic patronage, the elimination. Look at this: over 100 small states, reduced number of courts supporting the arts. That's what that is when France was declared, when the French Revolution occurred, rather than pockets of little fiefdoms, they all became part of a country. We looked at that map a minute ago, and we saw the Kingdom of Spain, which had been smaller fiefdoms, the Kingdom of states, etc., etc. And as a consequence, the musicians really were on their own. Became free agents. They had to do more public performances, teachings, commissions. Beethoven, if you recall, wrote music in his later life, not for a king, not for a court, as a commission situation. And then the rise of middle-class music making, and of course the rise of the middle class with the Industrial Revolution as a part of that. And we're moving now in society from having the kings and the aristocracy, and then the people that work for the aristocracy. We're moving into having people in the middle who are making They're on live with it. Excuse me for just a moment. I learned how to make music. There are ways in which the society is learning to use music as a form of social control, with state now beginning to sponsor operas and putting into those different places the political messages, and this gave rise to what's called nationalistic music, which we'll hit on in a little bit later. But music also began to include, to a greater extent, women, both in the making of the music and in the writing of the music. And in this picture, you see the lady at a pianoforte, which we recall is the early name for the piano, what we call the piano today. And it's kind of a square, it's on a square rectangle. There's one of these very similar to this. This is from early 1800s. There's one in the lobby of the Jim Petit Conference Center that's from 1865. It's a little bit larger than this one, but it's still, they call it a square grand. It's really a rectangular grand. I got the guy playing the violin here and the flute over here and a couple people singing, and she's stitching in there playing. So the making of music in the home became an important part of life. Six. So the piano starts to become much more important, affordable, put it into the home. You don't have to go to the palace to have your music. You can start to have music at home. Incidentally, if you were to take art and music class, you would see a correlation happening in the art world, where up until about the same time, 1600s or 1700s, paintings have been done for public spaces, for big spaces. And then with the onset of the people of Ghent, which is around the Netherlands area, and some of the work that they did, they started painting portraits the size that goes into the home. And that began to spread out, and art began to be something that was featured in the home as opposed to being featured in the palaces and churches. So these kinds of ideas are expanding throughout different ways with different genres of stuff. All right, so the piano becoming I just read this first line again. It always strikes me as funny. Musical accomplishment attracted a spouse. All right. And the frame format for that is having two players at the piano. And even today, you can get piano for 4 hands, which puts two people sitting side by side. Many times, two of our pianists at church will play a piano piece for 4 hands. And it's fun. And they can play a lot more notes with 10, 20 fingers instead of a 10. All right. We're going to bump on down. The Romanticism, or this period, is called the Romantic era. And it was applied to literature. We saw that in writing, and then into the art, and then into the music. And we contrast the two styles, classic era being what we had just left with Haydn and Mozart, very strict forms. Remember that in Haydn and Mozart, you might have an 8 or 16 measure phrase. We had a very clean introductory section of about 40 measures for Mozart, and then the piano came in and played, or the violin or whoever played the solo with a little bit of sparse accompaniment, but very structured, very clean, and poignant. The Romantic era then begins to play with those structures, play with that, and some people date that around 1820s, others around 1815, some as early as 1802, 1803, when, if you recall, Beethoven was having his wrestlings with going deaf and coming out of that with his fifth and sixth symphonies, which really began to influence the sound of the music, Romantic era. The reaction, really, to what's going on politically, the common folk, this romantic idea that we can have our freedom, that we can make this world better for ourselves, and it's also reflecting what's going on in nationalism of politics. Countries are rising. It's really the formation of countries, and then the beginning of the time when individuals are being more self-esteemed as well. We're going to skip a bit. Expressing intense emotions. So when most people think of a romantic era, romantic music, that's what they think of, intense emotions. And to be true, to be sure, the music reflects that in a lot of ways. And it's ideal to be done in instrumental music because you're not tied to the text. You don't have text you're working off, and your music can suggest different things and evoke different emotions, and even take you on a more rich journey as you listen to music than as you try to sort through the words that are going on. So in the Romantic era and early on, we talk about Beethoven as being one of those transitional people, but the vocal and piano is really the preferred way to go because they can do so much. And one of those languages, one of those forms is the German Lied. Just a reminder that in German, if you have two consonants together, two vowels together, you kind of lean toward that second vowel. So this L-I-E-D, it's not lied. The English, it's Lied. And if you were talking about one particular song, it would be a lieder, the L-I-E-D-E-R. That's really one of the more influential forms, and started growing in popularity around the 1800s. Oh, right there it is, lieder. Okay. The lyric, chief poetic genre, short strophic poems with one subject expressing personal feelings of romantic idea. We're going to skip a bit, brother. Franz Schubert, one of those guys that is just known mostly for his leader. He did write some other forms of music that we'll look at in later chapters, but in this chapter, for vocal song, we're looking at Franz Schubert, and you see his dates there. Piano schoolmaster, child studying playing with Salieri. Now, if you watch Amadeus, the movie Amadeus, you'll see Antonio Salieri featured in there. Salieri was a church musician and a teacher in Vienna forever. It seems like he taught so many people. He was older than Mozart and lived longer than Mozart, and was featured in that movie Amadeus, which I highly recommend just at least once. Have fun of it. It's a great show. Okay, but Franz Schubert became ill. There's a nice picture of what he might have looked like. There's his dates, 1797 to 1828. Right at the beginning, remember that our romantic dates, we're really looking at 1815 to 1820 is the start of that. So he really didn't have much life in it. But look at these lists of works, over 600 lieder. And one song is called the lieder. So he wrote 600 lieders. Song cycles, which are like a collection of lieders. Die schöne Müllerin and Winterreise. I'm sorry, I wait against my own pronunciation rule, where the second vowel gets the 9 symphonies by Schubert, 35 chamber works, and this is a good time to say that chamber works, which come up on the rise here, kind of reflect in a way what Mozart and Haydn dealt with. A chamber work. Okay, so remember that Beethoven was doing symphonies, and his Ninth Symphony had like 75 instruments, and then a full chorus and 4 soloists. 7 and 8, or a little bit smaller, like 5 and 6, anywhere from 60 to 70 players on stage. That's Beethoven. Going back years, the orchestra was, maybe 10 string players, 15 string players, and a couple oboes and a couple flutes. Really smaller, 15 to 20 players. So after Beethoven, we still have this smaller orchestra setting, and of course it's a lot cheaper to pay 20 musicians than it is to pay 65 musicians. And so this really the rise of chamber works, and Schubert wrote 35 chamber works for that smaller orchestra setting. 2 piano sonatas, again, a sonata is for a solo instrument. In the case of a piano sonata, it's a piano solo. If it's a violin sonata, it's a violin solo accompanied by piano. If it's a trumpet sonata, then it's a trumpet accompanied by piano. A sonata versus a concerto, which is a solo instrument of 2 to 3 instruments accompanied by an orchestra. A concerto is an orchestra. The sonata, concerto is an orchestra accompaniment. A sonata is piano, typically a piano accompaniment. Now, remember from earlier, just like 5 minutes ago, the piano has taken on this whole new meaning. It's about 100 years old now, and it's starting to come to a life of its own, and people have these in their homes. It's more accessible. So writing piano sonatas really makes perfect sense for somebody who's living his composition. 17 operas and Singspiels, 200 other choral works. He just wrote a ton of stuff that choirs sing. Some choirs still sing this today. Some of the texts that he used by Goethe, Müller, for the song cycles. And in the Romantic era, we see this idea that music is equal to the words. He's writing music that is as important as having the words. We had this discussion of the balance in other classes, the balance of words over text. In fact, when you took history and theology of worship arts, you would have had that tension going on all the way from Ambrose, and Augustine in the 300s through modern society, where some people say use all the music you can in all the ways you can to move people how you can. Some people say music takes away from the important thing, which is the text. So the more musical instruments you use, the less you get away from the text. The ideal being accompanied for acapella singing. And then, of course, right down the middle, a combination of the two, as Augustine said. Which can. Okay. So then he also brought in this ABA form or the bar form, AB. We're not going to listen to those. The Earl King is one of his great pieces. And he really is known for his beautiful melodies. I don't think that we actually play one of those yet. Let's see. But Gretchen at the Spinning Wheel, just an everyday event going on, based on Goethe's Faust. And it has these beautiful mood that's set. The 16th note figure in the right hand, and then the treadle, that's the spinning wheel, and then the treadle, which is the thing that the feet are going, which spins the wheel. And that the piano accompaniment just sets this sense of the wheel spinning, and then the song is placed over top of that. And there's an image of it. And we're not going to listen to it, but you see the spinning of the spinning wheel here. And then she comes in. My new whatever she goes on with that. Okay, so well, listen to a little bit of this song. This is a performance workshop, and we're not going to listen to the entire song. I need to check a setting here. This find out. We're going to listen to it. Check a setting. Oh, here are my settings. See if that doesn't happen. Listen to a bit. No, not that one. Skip it back.
Meine Ruhe ist hin, mein Herz ist schwer. Ich finde sie nimmer und nimmer mehr.
Piano in the background, playing the spinning.
Wo ich hin nicht hab, ist mir das Grab, die ganze Welt ist mir vergällt. Mein armer Kopf ist mir verrückt, mein armer Sinn ist mir zerstückt.
Singing and emoting on her own while she's spinning. So you have two actions going on: the spinning of the wheel and the consistency of that. She's going it. This is a fascinating video series by Benjamin Zander, one of the great conductors of our times. And you see, we're just barely into it here. 3:59, about 4 minutes. No. It actually ends 3:45 or so, and then he pops up. And it's a teaching session where he works with these peeps and brings them along in their interpretation. It's a fascinating video, and I would encourage you to watch it at some point, just for the value of doing that. That's Franz Schubert. Lindenberg from Renters is another one of his pieces with the piano reduction, the fluttering to let's just do that. Let's just listen to a bit. Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, one of the great baritones of when I was younger. And it's, I got to turn back up.
Am Brunnen vor dem Tore, da steht
what we see there are with songs and pianos. With songs are the opportunity for voicing, and then pianos are in homes. And one of the things that's happening in society is that because of the Industrial Revolution, which takes people to a place, an industry location to do their work, they're having more leisure time at home, and they can go to work, do their work, workplace time, and then come home and have leisure time, which is relatively new in the 1800s. And out of that arose the idea of the workday. And then I mentioned earlier the shift from the nobility and the church as the centers of music making, and them losing some of the aristocracy paying for that. So they needed a new way of doing things, and they needed to sell their stuff. We saw this before you were born, and back in the early 90s, when Russia, which had been communist for almost a century, declared perestroika in 1992 or 93. I went to Russia in 96 or 7, maybe 98, whenever I went to Russia. One of the things that we did was visit some of the schools, the music schools that were in the town that we visited. And they were complaining. They really wanted communism back because the communists paid, the communist system paid for them to be doing their craft. And when communists ended, they had to earn their way, and to write, and they had to teach, they had to show that they were educated enough to do what they were doing. I didn't have any sympathy, unfortunately, for them. But it's the idea that in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, as the aristocracy is falling, people got to earn their way, got to pay for themselves. So this idea of romanticism, we talked briefly about that a minute ago. The word is used by Friedrich Schlegel to identify a classic poetry as objectively beautiful, it's limited in scope, and it's universally valid. It's everybody can be affected by that particular idea of that poem. And romantic poetry is seen as transgressing the rules and moving beyond the rules that guide us, and having a sense of rich nature. Music is the same way. It takes the rules, bends them, breaks them, moves them out. So we have a rich sense of the feelings, the emotions, nature, whatever it is that we're looking at. Okay, so flip this page over. I think that's going to be a good amount of information for today, and we will pick up on our next session. On our next session, we will also have a couple of questions to answer. In fact, just drop me a quick email or write a note just telling me who we talked about today, and maybe what their dates are, or something to that effect. When we pick it up on our next session, we'll be looking at Robert and Clara Schumann, who are early 1800s. And have a great